Thanks, Eric, and thanks everyone getting up so early in the morning. It's late afternoon for me, and I only flew in last night, so if I keel over halfway through, apologies. You'll have my life support system's in the cupboard there. It's an enormous privilege and pleasure for me to be here. I've followed the work, Eric, that you've done. I just think it's marvellous, and the vitality and the energy that you've created here seems to me to be a model for work elsewhere. My only regret is that I travel around the world, like many of you, far too rapidly. I don't have long enough to stay put, so the last couple of years I've been here in San Francisco about 5 times, and I've never managed to get to meet you, so I'm delighted to be here. The last time I actually gave a keynote here in Berkeley was in the biochemistry faculty when I was talking about the history of wine. And I think really we should turn this all into a wine gathering. But I guess that's tonight. But I guess what I'm here to talk about a little bit is the transition from here to the last time I was here, and the changes that have taken place really in the last 10 years. But the sorts of things I was asked to talk about, and I'm going to try and keep it to half an hour. I was given sort of 45 minutes. If you want to ask me some questions, if I provoke you enough and you want to sort of get the Kalashnikovs out, that you just have to run into the next session a little bit. But the sort of 6 things that I have to compress into this half hour. The first is a look at how can somebody get enthused and passionate about the role of information and communication technologies infrastructure. And this is a railway line in Uganda that I was at a month or so ago. And the train arriving at platform 54 is, that's about how old I'm going to be sort of quite shortly. So how have I got where I am? That was one thing Melissa and Eric asked me to talk about. The other was crafting a research agenda in the field of information and communication technologies for development. And particularly to focus in, can academics do anything worthwhile in this area? I think that's a really important question. And those of you here from industry, it's great to have you here, and maybe we can get some dialogue on that. Thirdly, the inter or multidisciplinary role of ICTP and the challenges facing us in this work. Particularly, I thought I'd ask some of my graduate students questions around this at our last peer supervisory meeting, so I'm very much going to draw on what they have to say. Eric was particularly interested in, I'm often seen as a top-down to neo-fascist, couldn't be further from the truth. I'm really sort of bottom-up anarchist. But how do I manage to work for organisations like the World Economic Forum and have my friends in the former Soviet Union calling me a Trotskyist? Because some of these contradictions really need to be resolved. And this is the real challenge. The real challenge, you've got, as the Australians would say, a whinging Tom talking to you today. And I've never sort of thought that there were differences between European and US perspectives on this until I was asked what are the differences, and I don't think there are actually quite a lot. And perhaps just a link in here to Berkeley. Those of you who know the incredible geography school here will know that there's a guy called Carl Sauer early in the last century who developed a very famous landscape. Here's a nice landscape. I'm sure you recognise it on the floor of the Napa Valley. But about understanding places in the world, and that perhaps could be a recurrent theme. But to give you an insight where I'm going, now I didn't really like Michael Moore, I didn't really sort of get into his films particularly, but he has something very profound. How many of you have seen Sicko? And you know how, that's not many. I better be very careful what I say later. But it all comes down to me or we. And that's not WWE, but it's that's the conclusion of this, and I think there's an element of real importance there. So that's the agenda in half an hour. Let's go. I'm a geographer by training, and people here tend to think geography, that's about capes and bays, and maybe that's why one or two misadventures have happened in the world. But I sort of began very much working on medieval settlement. I learned medieval Latin. That's my foreign language. And I was working on medieval documents. But at the same time, I was working with a colleague in India on rural development issues. And this is, yes, believe it or not, young me working in northern Portugal in the early 1980s. So I had a strong interest in development agendas. Like anyone who was brought up in UK academia in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, and likewise here, if you weren't touched by good old Karl Marx, you are not going to sort of really understand the world. But I was always also interested in information communication technologies. Preparing this, I'd forgotten something I did when I was 11. Now, what have you forgotten what you did with 11? You've forgotten it. But I remember, yeah, balsa wood, do you all know what balsa wood is? So you make paper, or the balsa wood planes out of and ships. Well, I made my sort of ships to float my Roman soldiers down the bar. And I then decided that's too easy. So I actually remember I created a calculating machine out of balsa wood. You push one bit of wood in and you've got an answer out the other side. So I realised that sort of this was late 60s. I developed my own computer. So I'd always had that interest. But when I grew up a little bit, and those of you who remember sort of punch cards and you had a huge stack and you got one thing wrong, you had to wait 24 hours before it could run through again. So yeah, I was doing full-time programming then, and this was modelling medieval settlements in 1973. And designing programs to do this, and amazing, I still managed to track that down. So I realised that I'd always had that interest deep down inside as a research tool, but also in teaching. And how can we use ICTs in teaching? I've had that as a passion for many years, involved in various UK initiatives. Then, I guess we all do, we became a university manager, a head of department, and director of various things in the university. And that showed me the value of partnerships. I think as head of departments again in the mid-90s, I was really trying to get to grips with this idea that academia has to be relevant. So we created an external advisory board that had private sector, civil society, local government, central government representation on it. And all these themes have really come together in what I've been doing over the last 10 to 15 years. I then had the privilege, I don't know what you think of Tony Blair, hand up in favour, hand down, I'm not going there. But I had the pleasure of leading his Fundo initiative in the UK's Department for International Development, which is creating partnerships to use ICT in Africa. We created a partnership network of 40 organisations working in 8 African countries. It collapsed when I left, but that's another story. And most recently, and again, given that background, it's really bizarre that somebody can finish up as a director of the World Economic Forum, running their partnerships for education program with UNESCO. So that's how it's come full circle. And I want to sort of drill down actually into the ICT parts of it. Why geography and ICT for me? And let me just, 3 quick things. I'm not going to go into them in any detail. Get me any questions or later. But the nature of space-time. How many of you sort of have a basic physics background? The physics and theology come together in understanding the nature of space and time and the significance of globalization. That's how geographers always worked in. I think I mentioned sort of my training and my focus on difference and inequality. That's the centre of geography. And understanding the real world, unlike economists. How many economists got it so beautifully wrong as of now? Why they don't understand the real world. So 3 theoretical interests, but at a practical sense, what's that a map on? Maps are visualizations. What are we looking at here? No. So just throw any wacky ideas. Sorry? Life expectancy. Life expectancy. I've lived in Australia. And yeah, what else? Sorry? Literacy. Literacy, maybe. But think that all these things you're coming up with could correlate with what it actually is. Actually, it's fascinating that how low the US is here. The explanation is the significance of landlines. Italian reliance on that.
You can say on top.
Sorry?
You just said on top.
Yeah. Sorry, I missed that. It's just.
The question is now answered.
Yes. And what about that one? The dots are no information. Income should be. This is an answer to one of Eric's questions earlier. And the bottom line for working in ICT for D, if there's no bloody power here, we're pretty pissed. We're not actually going to be able to deliver very much. And people forget that. And that's why TIA has infrastructure there at its heart. So that's geography. Okay? Why it's important. It gets us to ask some interesting questions. The next theme was that, so that's the sort of theme one out of the way, crafting a research agenda. What should we be doing research on, how to go about it? And I really, when I left government, I was going back into the university world, and I thought, wouldn't it be easy just to carry on teaching the course on the history of wine? Sort of tasted it too, but it wasn't actually going to make a significant difference. And one of my real frustrations working in DFID, the UK's equivalent to USAID, is that there's actually almost no good research out there in this field. There's a lot of pretty bad consultancy. Government departments tend to use consultants with whom they're familiar, recycling over and over again. And so I wanted, and this was sort of 2003, 2004, I felt we need to foster excellence in this interdisciplinary field. Secondly, actually a focus on the poorest and the most marginalised. The private sector is going to take care of most people. If we're going to actually do something worthwhile, there's a need to address people who have least. And so that's going back here. So that's why working with these out-of-school youth, street kids in the Philippines. And realising that there weren't many programs for PhD students, there were for master's programs, I decided to concentrate particularly on that, and more of them in a minute. Secondly, it was very much built on the notion of a collective, this bottom-up agenda that Eric was talking about, and built on a particular model of partnerships that focuses on having both contributions and expectations, and being very transparent and open about that. There's nothing wrong about the private sector investing in a project in the expectation of getting returns if they're going to contribute worthwhile. And then aim to be truly collaborative. And I think there are lots of agendas there. I mean, Tia's had Eric very much driving it forward, but with a bottom up. And I mean, I have the same problem that I want it to be bottom up, but at the same time, sometimes I feel that I'm not driving it forward. How do you lead a collective? And the tensions of communalism that we'll come back to at the end. Yeah, I guess it's succeeded reasonably. We've got the State's UNESCO chair. We developed networks of collaborative activities, and perhaps best working with some fantastic guys across the world, as indicated in that. Which leads me on to what's actually the role of academics in this. And I've become, and my views have changed very much. And working in medieval settlement, perhaps you could say it's hardly been more esoteric and surreal. So what's the role of an academic in this? And I think that links into what I'm going to say about what we understand by development. And I guess when I was a graduate student, I believed in sort of purity of research and the freedom of research. I didn't understand that I was a pawn in somebody else's agenda. I now believe absolutely passionately there's no such thing as pure value-free research. We as researchers have absolute responsibility for what we do. All research has to be paid for in some way or another. And I think you in the US are perhaps much more aware of that than we've ever been in Britain, where you've been able to sort of sit in your university, teach what you like, and things are now very much changing. But all research has to be paid for, and that comes back to how can TIA carry on getting more funding. And again, as Eric said, there's a lot of money out there, but how can we use it for really important things? Independence of thought. Yeah, I think that does matter. As academics, our external opinions are really important. I've often been beguiled by the idea of going to do work for a particular corporation, and have done some, but if you work for any one organisation, you don't have that external ability to be critical. And I think that is hugely valuable. And again, for those private sector organisations here, how you can tap in to the highest quality research and have it as some kind of external validation of some of the work you're doing seems to be really important. We're in one of the greatest universities in the world. I'm in sort of 10th top research university in the UK, but we're not actually all that good. I've probably met more brighter people outside universities than I have inside universities in the last 10 to 15 years. So let's stop kidding ourselves. We can get a whole lot better in universities. We're not bad. I think actually many of us are bloody good, but we're not necessarily the brightest. And so that means how can we draw in some of the brightest from other parts of the world other communities into our work. And I think part of the problem is that the institutional structures, certainly in the UK, actually prevent engagement in practice. It is hugely difficult to get out and do the highest quality consultancy collaborative work because of our teaching, our research, our administration. And for that reason, I've actually gone part-time at the university. It's a challenge. I mean, Eric alluded to the fact that I have a number of different hats. But by going part-time at the university, it means that I actually have very, very much more freedom to do the sorts of work that I want to do. Hence, how I can work with that lovely view over Lake Geneva for some of the year. What about research agenda? Well, it's all here. I hope to be able to bring you copies, but as ever, the publisher is a little bit late, so I unashamed plug, the book is coming out. It's all in that, so this is going to be a tiny précis. And some ideas there. Take the rest of it. But I think that in summary are just three key things. We have to begin with the information and communication needs. And perhaps Eric didn't mention that enough in his beginning. We've a lot to learn from old work on theatre studies, informal communication, networking. And I think many people working in the technology field don't go back to the old literatures and therefore have made the same mistakes that people made in the past. If we begin with those, we can then think about the technologies that can best deliver them. And there's a diagram at the top. I mean, the middle is variable, but I think there are sort of three key agendas there. Individual and communal technologies, ease of access, high and low, cost to end user, high and low. And so being able to identify which technology for which information and communication needs seems to be really important. And the theme I'm going to focus on particularly is what do we mean by development? What do we mean by development? Where do your development interests lie? Are they supporting liberal democracy and economic growth? Are they supporting global revolution and terrorism? Are they supporting anarchic uprisings? Are they supporting government control over citizens? In the UK, we're just about to pass legislation where every single phone call, every single Skype message, every single email is going to be on the government database. And you know how our government databases tend to get lost occasionally when people leave laptops on trains. Really interesting things going on here. So that's what the book's about. I thought I'd have a bit of fun and do a tag crowd of my conclusion. And again, I could just spend 2 hours talking about that. Especially we've only 14 hours to go. But I think things that pick up here are the importance also I have mentioned so far of evaluation and of monitoring. I like the fact that I use the word people quite a lot. Access, being effective. What makes this effective? That's sort of an overview. And to come back, that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about for me anyway. It's giving these young people an opportunity to fulfill the potentials that they have and how we can use effective ICT for D, ICTs in delivering what these people want. I'm just, perhaps I may not say it later, my own core interests and passion working with what I think are some of the poorest and most marginalised. I mentioned street kids, but also people with disabilities, and I'll conclude a little bit on that. So now let me turn on to an interesting question at the top there. Who's the academic, who's the politician, who's the civil servant, and who's the businessman? We all look horribly the same. I mean, so anyway. Well, what about the multidisciplinary and the interdisciplinary challenges? And this is why I ask my graduate students. I'm mad, if you haven't already guessed it, but I have 15 PhD students working with me, which is unbelievable, fantastic. It means I get almost no undergraduate teaching except for stuff that nobody else wants to do, such as second-year techniques. But one of the things we're able to do with that, with a group that size, they have as much to learn from each other as they have from me. So we have peer supervisory meetings as well as one-on-one supervisory meetings. We do a lot of mad things together. So I was asking them about this multidisciplinarity, because they all come from different backgrounds, from computer science, from human-computer interaction, from media, one or two from geography. And I was surprised that they felt that I'm trying to impose one style. If it is, it's about creating absolute excellent research. I think a real challenge facing all, when I did my PhD, I was expected to know all the literature in my field. You can't do that nowadays. It's actually a challenge, being selective in what you choose. How do you decide what your research agenda is really important? And I think, my thoughts about we're actually crafting something new. And if we can work together, and the seminar, the session, the panel session this afternoon, about what sort of research, how we craft it, I think is really important. I don't give a damn that's not how it's done in HCI. Let's explore the new opportunities, the futures. I've got people writing their theses in parallel. New PhD students said, why can't I do it all online and share the community? Fine, do that as well. Have that DVD, which is actually the thesis, and presented in that way. Let's be open. But it's this balance between the technical and the social, again, that Eric alluded to at the beginning, is quite important. How do I write it all up? A real challenge. My response again, we have to strive for excellence. I think all too often, a lot of the stuff that happens in the academic world is second rate. It's not pushing the frontiers in the way that it can. And to me, so one of the biggest questions is how can we satisfy the demands of being an academic? Be it writing a traditional PhD, be it sort of inspiring undergraduate students, be it doing administration, writing papers, while making a difference on the ground. I remember when I was a kid, I had my first academic paper published, and I showed it to a colleague, senior colleague who I admired. And she said to me, Tim, you don't expect anyone's ever going to read it. That's true. The citation rate in most of our papers is 1.5 to 11. So we have to get out there, as you were doing in TIER, get our feet dirty, make a difference. And again, I mean, we haven't pre-prepared this, but it's learning to speak each other's languages across disciplinary divides is one of the things I find most exciting and challenging. And yeah, learning the various different sign languages as well. It's across disciplines, it's across cultures. Fortunately, most of my sort of foreign students, be they Dutch or Spanish or their native language is Kiswahili, their English is perfect, but it's not exactly the same. We can use the same. One of my PhD students is incredibly bright. She and I have been talking for a year about completely different things, because her understanding of one word is different from my understanding of one word. And I think she's so brilliant. So that's an issue. How do we then think what that actually research should be like? And I think we have fundamental differences of understanding of what research actually is. That's the core problem in much multidisciplinary research. Actually, the frameworks that people coming from our computer science department, our maths department, do you have a school of management here? Yeah. Aren't people in schools of management failed economists? Aren't people who teach economics in university people who can't get a job in the real world? Something like that. But their understanding of research is just so off what mine is. Being a geographer helped, because again, some of what I began with, showing the diversity of intellectual background. And I could get boring and theoretical, but at this hour of the morning, I don't think that's, you're yawning already, I do apologise. But yeah, that's what's up. But say something that's really inspired me is Jürgen Habermas's knowledge and human interest, theory and praxis, where he points out that different kinds of research have very different interests. And those of you who are into critical theory, maybe we can have a fun discussion later on. But I also think, and going back to perhaps this fact that nobody reads our papers, is how our research should be represented. It's an issue we need to consider in ICT for D. And make sure that we write different texts for different audiences. And by texts, I mean different kinds of representation. All my PhD students have to present, most of them work in partnership with other organisations, have short partnership reports that go back to the people in the field. Now, how do we enable the street kids, government officials, heads of state, private sector, understand what our research is about? It's up to us. It's not their fault that they won't read the thesis that thick. It's up to us that we don't make that accessible enough for them. And I think that's a failing generally across academia, but I think a lot of ICT4D work as well, in particular, doesn't get through to the audience as it should. It's a new game. Above all, I see ICT4D as a really radical challenge to established academic practice to development agendas as a whole. And to give you just a way into that, it all comes down to the 4D. It all comes down to what we understand by development. What we understand by development determines the nature of our practice. And to simplify greatly, so I need to draw to a conclusion, I guess most of you recognise that the hegemonic model of global international development, it actually believes it's possible to eliminate poverty. Do you believe that? Come on, get real. We will never eliminate poverty. Because the real thing that matters is relative poverty. The easiest way, what's the easiest way to halve the people in the world defined as being absolutely poor? It's to devalue the dollar by 50%. So, my interest is in how we use these technologies, these really powerful things, to address the needs of young kids like this in Zambia. And to me, development is above all a moral agenda. Yes, like carbon maths, I do believe in enlightenment. I have great fun in writing wacky, intellectual, postmodern pieces. But in the end, we as both academics and human individuals have a responsibility for our brothers and sisters. And this goes way beyond the academy. And the challenge is therefore, what I mentioned earlier, how do we combine academic research, in inverted commas, on development issues with actually helping poor people change their lives? And I've been playing around with this in a paper that's become far too long, called On the Richness of Africa. I guess most people in this room see Africa as poor. This paper argues that actually Africa is incredibly rich. And if we can build on that richness instead of trying to change the quality, maybe we can make a difference. And very briefly, as a sort of diagram, I think we can sort of look at this in a number of different ways, but we have development as economic growth. Here in Thailand, a knowledge centre. All development as empowerment. And I guess most academic researchers tend to go into ever smaller circles. Some would say playing with themselves, but I couldn't possibly use that kind of terminology. And others, and this can be both sort of life paths, or so we start outside academia, we then spend the time doing our PhDs, and we then go into the private sector and earn loads of dollars or pounds. Or we can take a somewhat more complex route and finish up exploring development in power. And note colours as well. So lots of different ways of approaching this. So I'm going to very swiftly move to a conclusion. What are the challenges in doing this? And I think Eric's touched on these. But let's be honest, most initiatives are top-down, most have failed. You have lots of computers that put into teacher training colleges without even the capacity. But the challenge is that the bottom-up rarely goes to scale, and we can come back and discuss that. Most tend to be supply-led rather than demand-driven. Again, supply-led usually fails, but this is one of the biggest challenges. People don't know what they can do, they don't know what their needs are, unless they have some way of actually understanding what the potential is. So I think here, the development of workshops to get together collaboratively important. Technology-led or information and communication-led. Most are technology-led and therefore fail, so don't deliver on the information and communication needs. And what about sustainability? This again, in like terms, is a challenge that we can explore later. I think even to ask about sustainability means you've got the wrong business model. You have lots of pilot projects people put in. They can be done, they work. Pilot projects are easy. And then people say, okay, take the Nepali Schools Initiative, for example. And let's scale that up. They're saying, well, you can't do it because no one's going to put that level of money into something at scale. You've got the wrong business model. And you don't even need to think about sustainability if you have the right business model in place. Something I'm having great difficulties with at the moment, and I would love to have feedback from you, is whether a needs-based or a rights-based approach is more appropriate. I think much of the literature in development, and George, maybe you come back on this, is that rights-based is where we should be going. Do people have information and communication rights? Do they? Maybe, but they also have urgent needs now, and if we tend to concentrate too much on the right, maybe we don't focus enough on the needs of these street kids in the future. Okay, I'm going to speed up even faster. Because of all that, I think one of the answers, not the only one, but one of the most powerful answers is working collaboratively in partnerships. And bringing most people together. And that's one of the exciting things about my work at Davos, in the World Economic Forum, for example. We're getting John Chambers, the Dutch Prime Minister, the head of UNESCO. Does anyone recognise the head of this bully? No, I didn't say that. On the left, walked around. But he's not doing a bad job at the moment. And actually getting these people together in a room, working collaboratively to understand the problems and come up with solutions. And the workshop here I just led in August in Orlando. To do this well, to craft partnerships, to bring people together, to inspire them to move the frontiers forward is very difficult. Okay, finally, and this is the gay meeting in San Jose a year or so ago, and the German meeting, BMZ, the German Ministry for Development, earlier this year. I'm not sure there's that much difference. But you asked me to talk about this, so here's my effort. And I should preface what I say by what I said at the beginning. I think there's some fantastic work going on in both parts of the world, but we need to be challenged by it. And the first is I think there are fundamental differences between the aid systems. In Europe, we've untied aid, whereas here in the US, basically tied aid systems still function. We've moved towards budget support mechanisms in Europe. I'm very critical of budget support mechanisms. I actually think that the way in which USAID delivers project aid is valuable. But I've got good friends in aid, and they're quite upfront about this. That aid here is an instrument for US foreign policy. And that has massive implications with it, particularly if you as academics ally yourselves to it. But the project-based aid does mean it is possible to deliver things on the ground in practice if projects work. European donors have moved away from project aid for a whole range of reasons, but most importantly to try and get a systemic intervention. What are the implications for us? I think that the modality of delivering ICT-PD, most European donors, ICT-PD has gone off the agenda. It's become mainstream, like gender has become mainstream. The only way to get funding is to get the Ministry of Technology or Higher Education in your African country to fund it, and they may have different interests. Bless you. So tied and untied aid is an important area of difference. And this is my sort of more or less penultimate slide of the main, that I think this difference in individual and communal agendas is hugely important. The more I come to the SD, the more I realise that although we speak a similar language, we come from a very different background. Community radio station here in Uganda. The huge dangers of an essentialising discourse, of course there's diversity in Europe, huge diversity, there's huge diversity here. But I think there is an element that the US, and this comes back to SICO, that the US does focus perhaps on the individual more on the communal. And that means that some of my very good American friends have difficulty in understanding traditional African communal institutions. And one of my arguments in on the richness of Africa paper is that if we're going to use information and communication technologies effectively in Africa, we would build on traditional African communal ways of thinking, functioning, operating. And I almost go as far as saying the notion of democracy may not be appropriate, or our notions of democracy, which in the UK and the US are of course different. Maybe we should be exploring African institutions and seeking to support them rather than imposing external ones. And I think there are wider implications we might tend to think of. There are many, if we take this individual argument, the personal computer. That's actually quite a bizarre thing in a communal tradition. So in much of Africa, the most successful things have been radio, TV, and that goes back to my original diagram that I drew. Yes, Melissa, I'm about to finish. And then there has been this global support for liberal democracy and economic growth. You're aware that I've challenged that already. And I think we could have a long discussion about what we may emerging regions and the ICT 4D, and you can understand why my focus is on 4D. But you can also, I have a good friend from Colombia, and she's been doing a lot of work overseas, and she said, Tim, you told me this 5 years ago. And she said, only now do I realise how hating I am when I go to many countries overseas. And I think you need to be aware that even the optimists, we will change this country, fine, we will change the world. I come as a friend and as a colleague, but I see many, many challenges around that agenda. Let's quickly, okay, I'm just looking to the future. I love that. To me, the biggest challenge is the infrastructure. I like that. Cell phone expansion. Okay, I was going to say some stuff about accessibility and the importance of working with people who have fewer disabilities than everyone else who's talking about. Maybe Melissa, can I just show that? Let's go quickly. Move out of that. Let's just. Thank you ever so much for inviting me. I hope I've introduced some of the themes. I deliberately tried to link into the themes that we're going to be exploring later today. I look forward to working with you in the future. I think there are immense opportunities for our different networks to collaborate. We actually have a little bit of money, not a lot. We'll be right down here on your list. But I look forward to getting to know you all better over the next 48 hours. And once again, thank you for your patience and your time and the smiling occasion you must have.
So we have time for a couple questions, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Dr. Unwin, for your talk. And I want to hug you for talking about Africa as looking at the donut instead of the hole that it is. I work in a community of 500,000 people, and maybe 2,000 of them have cell phones. I don't work in India. I don't work on cell phones. I think people are talking about the richness. But in light of that, I want to ask you, how can we help technologists understand that radio, especially community radio, is a rich platform as opposed to something that isn't inherently sexy? Because these new form factors, HCI stuff, computer sex, the sexy part, that's the innovative part. And in fact, it's those technologies, I believe, that are the most accessible, that are deemed, not valuable and discounted by technologists in this space.
Yeah, I absolutely. One way I'd answer is to actually begin by asking why computers, etc., and sexy, as you put it. I didn't possibly use that vocabulary. But yeah, and I think that's partly what I was alluding to in this to individual and communal solutions. I think the rich countries of the world, at the high end of my diagram, we're focusing on that end. It is also, radio's old technology. I mean, I love new things. I love innovating. I get a buzz sort of when I do an experiment and something works. I say, hey. So I think there's that to it as well. I think you asked what's the answer. And there are institutional factors preventing us doing it, because it's much easier to sit in your lab and write a great paper than spend a month in the field. And all those hassles as well. And most of my students have had malaria or ill hearts or something. That knocks them out. Yes.
Dr. That was an intriguing presentation. Can I ask you a question from someone who's a surgeon here? I'm writing a book on energy justice, located here in my sabbatical out in Colorado. To what extent does communications technology or information technology relate to something that we are intensely committed to doing, which is appropriate and intermediate technology? In other words, I'm talking about the world of cook stoves, cradle pumps, biodigesters, solar lanterns, the kind of stuff that a dollar a day people need to have before they can leapfrog into the high technology. And unfortunately, I'm a little jaundiced. I still see cell phones as high technology.
No, again, these two questions are almost the same. That communal solutions, radio, television, to me, are part of the answer. I grant and you made relatively cheaply about this news. Again, one of my graduate students is working on this in Malawi, rolling out across the Malawian education system, delivering radio lessons and to wind up radio. So there are. You touched on solar. I think there's some really cool experiments and things happening with solar. If we could get solar power actually to function effectively, or more effectively than it does, I don't think that there are any solar solutions that are yet sufficiently robust, say, to provide solar energy for school anywhere in the world. To me, that's really important. I've done some work on even using small hydro power. One of the interesting things about ICT is you've got to convert it to electricity. So whatever energy, by definition almost, it's electric based. So I think there are beginning to be solutions. I'm very empathetic towards your argument, but I think radio, television, film, there are all sorts of ways. And using it perhaps to help people helping others, so using ICT to help civil society organisations, to help the agricultural extension officers, to help women's groups. We can talk later, there are solutions out there that are appropriate. Yes, go on.
Tim Forster. You mentioned that there's a difference between the needs-based approach and the rights. How does declaring a right create some action? How does talking about rights change it?
I think it does. If you talk about rights, raises awareness, undoubtedly. Internet governance agenda, some of the rights-based things that came out of this is, I do think about it raises, and if you argue there are rights, then you get that accepted in global agenda. So UNESCO is very, very rights-based. People have the right to information, say. If you do that, then it's incumbent on governments to deliver that right, because you're not saying it. Now, it's a huge debate, and one of my problems here is that excessive argument on rights, I think it's individual based. I'm going out on a bit of a limb here, but it's individual rights that comes back to the individual agenda, whereas communal responsibilities, to me, are probably more important. But again, maybe that's partly because I come from a communal background. The rights agenda often ignores responsibility, and you can spend a lot of time talking about it. There are pressing needs on the ground that we can do something about that. Let's get out of it. It's a huge subject, and I'd love to talk to you later. I'll get back.
Let me just get to seems like they're
Sinesh, I think I've got this working, but I can't guarantee anything.
Who is a tier student, Sinesh Sarana, and talking about the Air project that affected the people I showed in the opening. I would say that interesting communal project in the sense that although we're providing medicine for individuals, it very much works and sustainably depends on the fact that it's a clinic in a rural village and that the clinic is a community resource. And so I think it's, we've never actually used the word communal in tier until just this second. But it actually, I think it does capture a lot of our thinking. We tend to talk about shared technologies, and what we mean by that is communal. But this is why we need to get different perspectives. All right, Sinesh.
Thanks, Eric.